you have read, I know you have read the entire research and analysis of this particular paper that issues that have been raised. Does it come to you as a surprise, considering the fact that the world, has done a lot in terms of development, in terms of vaccines development, in terms of medication, among others? Does it come to you as a surprise that we still have these bacterial pathogens killing a lot of people than even HIV?
It does. I think many people would expect that these pathogens, aren't such killers as they are. So it is quite surprising that they are still there in the community, still causing a lot of harm. Well, I think some of the deaths from these pathogens are sort of hidden because we tend to cluster things together in syndromes like pneumonia or a bloodstream infection or a wound infection, and don't really dig into the details to see what are the bacteria causing those problems. And that's when you do that, you reveal that some bacteria that most people aren't that familiar with are actually at the root cause of multiple different syndromes. And so part of the research is to shed light on the importance of these bacteria.
This common bacteria bacterial pathogens known by many experts is the leading cause of death. Is the second leading cause of death, and Sub-Saharan Africa has recorded a lot of mortality linked to this bacteria. What are we seeing in Africa, that in Sub-Saharan Africa, that we are recording this mortality?
That's an excellent question, and I think part of it relates to the risk factors for some of the infections like pneumonia, like wound infections, like skin infections. These are more common in Africa, very common in West Africa. That has to do with both the environment, malnutrition, lack of vaccination in some cases, for example, for Streptococcus pneumonia. So those all come together to make the risk of those infections. So some of the big bacteria that people aren't familiar with but are very common causes of illness are things like Staph aureus or Klebsiella pneumonia or E. coli or Pseudomonas. These are whole families of bacteria that are surprisingly common. They cause pneumonia in little kids. They cause pneumonia in adults. They cause skin infections that then can become more generalized. They cause wound infections, urinary tract infections. So they attack the body in many ways. And these bacteria, which nobody has ever heard the names of unless you're a specialist or a physician, are really quite common. And so they're present and have turned out to be important killers in the world.
Do we know the figures in Ghana, the mortality rate in Ghana?
Sure. If you look at the number of deaths in Ghana, as best we know, a bacteria like Staph aureus causes 6,000 deaths a year. Klebsiella, another 5,000. Strep pneumonia, another 5,000 deaths. E. coli, maybe 3,500 deaths a year. So quite substantial numbers of deaths in Ghana from these bacteria.
Compared to other diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, and other stuff like HIV?
Yes, so tuberculosis would be about 10,000 deaths. And then, malaria would, off the top of my head, I don't remember the number, but it's about that same magnitude, and HIV somewhat less. So these are very substantial killers of the similar magnitude to HIV, TB, and malaria. And if you put those top 5 bacteria together, they would be larger than HIV, TB, or malaria on their own.
Okay, so we have also seen the analysis indicating that HIV research was awarded $42 billion, while other bacterial pathogens like E. coli research was awarded $800 million. And do we think that this could actually be the reason why we have not paid so much attention in these bacterial infections or bacterial pathogens that cause a lot of death?
I think the world has not invested enough in research for these bacterial pathogens. And it's partly because they're sort of hidden. They cause a piece of pneumonia, a piece of skin infections, a piece of urinary tract infections. So some of the research funders don't see the totality of their impact. And that's why we put all this data together, so that hopefully people recognize the importance of these bacterial pathogens in the future. The way forward, I think, is to pay more attention to these pathogens, look at ways we can manage them now through, in the case of strep pneumo, through vaccination, in the case of the other pathogens, through infection control in healthcare facilities, through improvements in some of the risks of these infections, water and sanitation, malnutrition. But also in the long run, the world needs to invest in vaccines and new drugs for these pathogens. But at this point, it doesn't seem like investments in a vaccine are working very well. And there doesn't seem to be any prospect in the near future or in the next even 10 years, perhaps, or even longer for a vaccine. So I think there's probably a need to rebalance the research and development focus to give more attention to these pathogens.